May 21, 1982. San Carlos Water, East Falkland. Just after dawn. Argentine aircraft are coming in low, impossibly low, skimming the surface of the South Atlantic at heights that would end a commercial pilot's career before the debrief was finished. They are hunting the ships below, packed into a narrow channel, offloading troops onto beaches while anti-aircraft fire tears apart the sky above them. The Skyhawks and Daggers press through that fire at speeds above 500 knots, their wingtips nearly brushing the water. They drop their bombs. The bombs travel through perhaps 100 feet of air before they hit British steel. The weapons punch through the hull, pass through compartments, come to rest somewhere inside the ship, deep in the machinery spaces, wedged against a bulkhead, half buried in a flooded forward magazine. And they don't explode. By the time Argentine air operations over the Falklands concluded, 13 bombs had buried themselves inside British warships without detonating. HMS Antrim, Broadsword, Argonaut, Glasgow, Plymouth, a list that reads like a roll call of what almost became a fleet catastrophe. The Argentine pilots who delivered those bombs had flown through walls of anti-aircraft fire, had watched their colleagues shot from the sky, and had put their weapons directly on target. The bombs just didn't work. Marshal of the Royal Air Force, Lord Craig, is said to have compressed the entire war's calculus into a single sentence. 6 better fuses, and we would have lost. That assessment wasn't Argentine revisionism. It came from a senior British officer, from the victors themselves. A quiet admission that the most celebrated British military triumph since the Second World War had been decided not by strategic genius or superior firepower, but by a fault in a small propeller on the nose of a bomb. 6 fuses that worked properly, and the ships that survived don't survive. The task force's escort screen collapses. The amphibious landings at San Carlos fail. The Argentine flag stays over Stanley. The damage reports, the Board of Inquiry findings, and the memoirs of the commanders who lived through it tell a more uncomfortable version of what happened in the South Atlantic in 1982. This is that version. Argentine forces invaded and occupied the Falkland Islands on April 2, 1982. 3 days later, the British government ordered a task force to sea. Rear Admiral John Sandy Woodward was appointed commander of the battle group, handed the task of recapturing a fortified island group 8,000 miles from the UK, 400 miles off the Argentine coast, with no local airbase, no Allied naval support, and a fleet not designed or maintained for sustained offensive operations at the southern end of the world. The professional assessment among those who studied the problem without a political outcome to defend was that the operation was barely feasible. The task force's most dangerous structural weakness had been carved out years before any Argentine soldier set foot on the Falklands. When HMS Ark Royal was decommissioned in 1978, the Royal Navy lost its last conventional fixed-wing carrier, and with it the Fairy Gannet, an aircraft whose sole operational purpose was airborne early warning. AEW is what extends a task force's eyes beyond the radar horizon. A ship's radar is constrained by the curvature of the Earth. At sea level, it can only see as far as its antenna height allows before incoming aircraft or missiles disappear into the radar shadow of the ocean's own curve. An AEW aircraft flying at altitude sees much further. It detects low-level threats while they are still hundreds of miles distant, and relays that picture down to the ships below. The Royal Navy knew the gap existed. The intended replacement was a radar-modified version of the Hawker Siddeley Nimrod maritime patrol aircraft. The Nimrod AEW program had been running for years and had already become a byword for cost overruns and schedule failures. It wasn't operational in 1982. It wouldn't become operational. The program was cancelled entirely in 1986, having consumed hundreds of millions of pounds and produced nothing deployable. The gap the Gannet had filled remained open. What this meant for Woodward's ships in the South Atlantic was tactically precise. Without AEW coverage, the fleet's ship-based radar systems couldn't reliably detect aircraft approaching at low altitude until those aircraft were already inside weapons release range. The Sea-Dart surface-to-air missile, the task force's primary long-range air defense, needed a radar lock to engage its targets. More critically, it had a minimum engagement altitude, a floor below which the system's acquisition radars struggled to separate an aircraft from sea clutter. Argentine strike aircraft that flew below that floor could penetrate the defensive zone before Sea-Dart could respond effectively. The pilots needed to know exactly where that floor was. Argentine command had already worked it out. Their pilots had been briefed accordingly. HMS Sheffield was a Type 42 destroyer, 410 feet long, a complement of 281 crew, equipped with Sea-Dart and a suite of sensors intended to give the task force a long-range picture of the air threat around it. On the morning of the 4th of May 1982, she was on forward picket duty, positioned ahead of the main carrier group as one of 3 Type 42 destroyers whose purpose was to extend the fleet's radar coverage and engage incoming threats before they reached the carriers. Picket duty placed these ships at maximum exposure. They were the furthest forward. They were the ones in range first. That was the job. 2 Argentine Navy Super-Étendard aircraft took off from Rio Grande Air Base in Tierra del Fuego that morning, each carrying a single AM-39 Exocet missile. At the controls of one of them was Captain Augusto Bedecarats of 2 Escuadrilla, the Argentine Naval Aviation Unit that had received the Super-Étendards and their Exocets in a French delivery completed only weeks before the war began. The 2 aircraft flew south over the South Atlantic at low altitude, navigated toward the task force, and, at a calculated moment, illuminated their targeting radars briefly. The burst was enough. Large radar contacts acquired. Targeting data fed to the Exocet seeker heads. Both aircraft descended back toward the wave tops. The missiles were armed and ready. HMS Glasgow, another Type 42 on picket duty, detected the 2 Super-Étendards at a range of over 70 kilometers and transmitted the fleet warning code word handbrake. That signal reached HMS Invincible, one of the 2 carriers. Officers aboard Invincible failed to properly relay the Exocet warning to Sheffield and the other ships in the screen. The warning existed. It was in the system. It didn't reach the ship that needed it most. Sheffield had other reasons for complacency. Her operations room had previously assessed the Exocet threat as overrated. When a warning did eventually filter through, the ship treated it as a probable false alarm. Sheffield didn't go to action stations. No chaff was launched. The metallic clouds that British ships could fire to seduce radar-guided missiles away from their hulls. Captain James Salt, Sheffield's commanding officer, wasn't informed that an Exocet warning was circulating in the fleet. At 14:02 local time, the missile hit Sheffield, amidships on the starboard side, 8 feet above the waterline. It punched a hole 15 feet wide and 4 feet tall through the hull. Inside the ship, the Exocet's propellant ignited. Fires broke out in the operations room, the forward damage control compartment, and the main computer room within seconds of impact. The warning shout, "Exocet!" reached the bridge moments before the ship's broadcast ordered the crew to take cover. Multiple crew accounts placed the time between that shout and the impact at fewer than 20 seconds. Some accounts say less. For men below decks who hadn't heard either warning, there was no interval at all. The fires proved impossible to control. Sheffield's firefighting capability had been degraded by the precise location of the strike. The missile had passed through compartments the ship needed intact to fight fire below decks. Smoke moved through the ventilation system faster than the crew could isolate compartments. Of Sheffield's 281 crew, 20 were killed. The majority of them died not from the initial impact, but from smoke inhalation as the fires spread through the ship's interior spaces. 26 more were injured. Captain Salt, recognizing that the fires would eventually reach the Sea-Dart magazine and produce a secondary explosion of catastrophic scale, ordered the ship abandoned. Her crew left her burning and took to life rafts and attending vessels. Sheffield burned for 6 days. Recovery teams attempted to take her under tow, but the structural damage was too severe. On May 10th, while still under tow, she foundered and sank. She is now a designated war grave on the floor of the South Atlantic, with 20 of her crew. The Board of Inquiry report on Sheffield's loss, reference DEFE 25/555, held at the UK National Archives, was eventually released in a largely unredacted form. Its findings document in procedural language the accumulated failures that had left the ship exposed. The warning generated by Glasgow that Invincible failed to pass in time. The threat assessment that had normalised complacency about the Exocet. The absence of the radar coverage that might have extended the detection window. A 2015 technical re-evaluation using analytical methods unavailable in 1982 concluded that Sheffield's Exocet warhead had in fact detonated during the attack, contradicting the original Board of Inquiry finding, which had concluded the ship was destroyed by propellant fire rather than warhead explosion. Two official investigations, 40 years apart, don't agree on what precisely killed her. They agree on the casualty count. The destruction of a modern British destroyer by a French-built sea-skimming missile sent an immediate shockwave back to London. And it imposed on Woodward's headquarters a calculation that would define British naval planning for the rest of the campaign. Sheffield had been struck by one of 5 air-launched AM-39 Exocets that Argentina had possessed at the start of the war. 4 remained. From the moment Sheffield went dark, those 4 missiles became the central obsession of British Naval Command. The 2 ships Britain absolutely couldn't afford to lose were HMS Hermes and HMS Invincible, the task force's aircraft carriers. They carried the Sea Harriers, providing fighter cover over the fleet. They carried the close air support aircraft the land campaign would need once troops were ashore. They weren't merely valuable assets. They were the operational foundation on which every other element of the campaign depended. A single Exocet into a carrier's flight deck, among fueled and armed aircraft, wouldn't have merely damaged a ship. It would have ended Britain's capacity to project air power into the theatre, and with it the capacity to protect the amphibious force and support troops on the ground. The war would have been over. Woodward kept the carriers well back from the islands throughout the campaign, beyond the radius that Argentine strike aircraft could reach with a full bomb load and sufficient fuel to return. But AM-39 Exocets, launched from Super Étendard, had a significantly longer effective range than a bomb-laden Skyhawk. The carriers were never entirely outside the threat envelope, and Woodward's memoir, 100 Days, the primary first-person account of commanding the battle group, conveys what it felt like to be responsible for assets that were simultaneously irreplaceable and impossible to fully protect. Every planning cycle carried the same arithmetic. 4 Exocets unaccounted for. 2 ships that couldn't survive being hit. Britain's response operated at two levels simultaneously. Operationally, intensive efforts were made to track and potentially neutralise the super-étendard aircraft and their shore-based support infrastructure. Covertly, British intelligence moved to block Argentina from acquiring replacement Exocets on the international arms market. Peru had been identified as one potential source. MI6 conducted operations specifically aimed at impeding those transactions, intercepting the resupply chain that would have reset Argentina's Exocet inventory above zero if the remaining missiles were expended. The precise mechanics of that intelligence effort remain partially classified, but the intent is documented. Argentina had started the war with 5 missiles, and London intended to ensure they stayed at 5 or fewer. 2 more Exocets were fired on May 25th. Both struck the same vessel. It wasn't a carrier. MV Atlantic Conveyor was a Cunard container ship, requisitioned in April 1982 and converted with extraordinary speed into a military aviation ferry. She carried Harrier spare parts, tentage and field equipment for troops ashore, and helicopters. 4 Boeing Chinook HC-1 heavy-lift helicopters and a complement of Westland Wessex helicopters. The Chinooks were the task force's primary means of moving heavy equipment and large numbers of troops across terrain that had no roads, no hard standing, and ground conditions, boggy peat moorland cut by ridgelines, that made wheeled transport impractical across much of the island's interior. Without the Chinooks, British logistics in the Falklands couldn't function as planned. There were no equivalent aircraft available as replacements anywhere in the South Atlantic. The 2 Exocets struck Atlantic Conveyor in the late afternoon of the 25th of May. 12 crew members were killed. The ship caught fire and burned for 3 days before sinking. In her holds, she took 3 Chinook helicopters, most of the Wessex complement, and significant quantities of tentage that troops already ashore were depending on for shelter during the coming Southern Hemisphere winter. 1 Chinook had been airborne at the moment of impact. ZA-718, tactical call sign Bravo November, was on a mission when the missiles struck, and came back to find that the vessel it had launched from was a burning wreck. Bravo November landed on an alternative ship and went back to work. It was the only heavy-lift helicopter left in the South Atlantic. Over the following weeks, Bravo November flew the schedule that 4 aircraft were supposed to share. It operated in conditions that routinely exceeded its certified parameters: high winds, zero visibility, mountain terrain in the dark. At one point during the campaign, the aircraft lifted 81 troops in a single sortie. The Chinook's published maximum payload was approximately 45 troops in normal operating conditions. The crew flew the mission because no alternative existed. The aircraft was airworthy. The mission was necessary. The manual's limits were a peacetime consideration. The absence of the other 3 Chinooks had cascading effects on the land campaign that began immediately. The plan had assumed helicopter transport to move troops and heavy weapons forward across the island. Without the Chinooks, that transport didn't exist at anything like the required capacity. British soldiers who were supposed to be lifted into position would march instead, across moorland, carrying equipment loads of 80 to 100 pounds per man, in weather that February is worse in the Falklands than January is in Scotland. 45 Commando Royal Marines covered 50 miles in 3 days from San Carlos to Douglas Settlement. 3 Para made a parallel march of similar length and duration. These movements weren't planned as endurance demonstrations. They were improvisations around a logistics gap created when 2 Exocets hit a container ship on a Tuesday afternoon. Atlantic Conveyor also illuminated how close the margin remained around the carriers themselves. Those two missiles had been tracking toward targets in the vicinity of the carrier group. The task force's escorts responded by firing chaff, the standard countermeasure, metallic clouds intended to seduce the missile's radar seekers away from warship hulls. The full mechanics of the terminal phase remain unestablished in available declassified records. The prevailing account holds that the chaff drew the missiles away from the warships, and two Exocets found Atlantic Conveyor rather than a carrier. The consequences of those missiles striking Hermes or Invincible would have been categorically different from the consequences of striking a container ship, not a strategic setback, but the end of the campaign. Atlantic Conveyor was replaceable, eventually. The carriers weren't. Argentina had now expended 3 of its 5 Exocets. The carriers had not been touched. 2 missiles remained. While the Exocet threat played out at the strategic level around the carrier group, the war inside San Carlos water was demonstrating something even more fundamental about the margin of British survival. And it was doing it through a mechanical irony that no amount of operational skill or tactical planning had produced. The amphibious landings required warships and supply ships to hold position inside a confined channel, unable to disperse or maneuver freely while troops and equipment went ashore. Argentine air power, a 4 Skyhawks of the Argentine Air Force and Navy, 1A1 Daggers of Group 06, flew sortie after sortie against those ships through the landing phase and the days that followed. The attacks came in waves through the daylight hours, sometimes coordinated, always at extremely low level, always pressing hard against the defensive fire coming up from the ships and from missile teams positioned on the hills surrounding the anchorage. Argentine aircrew losses during this phase were severe. The pilots flew into concentrated fire from Seacat missiles, blowpipe shoulder-launched missiles, 40mm Bofors guns, and small arms from troops ashore, and they kept going. The willingness to press home attacks under those conditions, at those altitudes, against that concentration of defensive fire, wasn't tactically routine. It was extraordinary. The tactical instruction that made it survivable was technically correct. Sea Dart's engagement envelope had a lower altitude limit, a floor below which the system's acquisition radars couldn't reliably separate aircraft from sea clutter at close range. Argentine Command had identified that floor and briefed their pilots to fly below it. Aircraft that flew low enough and fast enough could penetrate to weapons release range before the longer-range defences could engage them. At the cost of significant pilot and aircraft losses to short-range systems, the tactic delivered bombs to target. It's the reason those bombs hit British ships. It's also, with perfect mechanical logic, the reason those bombs didn't destroy them. The fuses on Argentine 1,000-pound general-purpose bombs operated on a straightforward principle with a specific consequence. At the nose of each bomb was a small propeller. When the bomb was released, airflow through the propeller turned it. The propeller had to complete a minimum number of rotations before an internal mechanism finished the arming sequence and the weapon became live. This was a standard safety feature, intentional by design. Without a minimum arming distance, a bomb released at low altitude could detonate immediately after release and destroy the aircraft that dropped it. At conventional attack altitudes of several thousand feet, a falling bomb had ample air to travel through and ample time for the propeller to complete its required rotations. The weapon arrived fully armed. This is how it was designed to work, and, at those altitudes, it worked exactly as designed. Released from a few dozen feet above the sea surface, the bomb had almost nothing to fall through. The propeller barely moved. The fuse couldn't complete its arming sequence. The weapon struck the ship, punched through the hull on the kinetic energy of its delivery. A 1,000-pound object moving at the speed of a fast jet aircraft, passed through decks and bulkheads and machinery spaces, and came to rest somewhere deep inside the vessel. An inert 1,000-pound mass that was, in every technical sense, still waiting to arm. Multiple independent post-war assessments of the air campaign reached identical conclusions on this point. A DTIC report on Argentine tactical air employment states directly that their pilots repeatedly pressed home their attacks at such low altitudes that the bomb fuses didn't have sufficient time to arm before impact. A separate analysis from the same source archive identifies the fuse failure as the decisive factor in the fleet's survival during the landings, recording that the bombs had insufficient time for fuse arming before hitting their target. Academic analysis from multiple institutions reached the same finding from different evidence. The altitude that kept Argentine pilots alive inside the C-Dart engagement envelope was precisely and mechanically the altitude at which their bombs couldn't detonate. There was no resolution to this problem available to the pilots in the air or their commanders on the ground. Fly higher at arming altitude, and C-Dart engages them on the way in. The Argentine Air Force was already sustaining painful losses. Accepting higher casualties in exchange for armed bombs would have been a brutal and perhaps unsustainable trade, even if the tactical leadership had authorized it. Fly at wave height to survive the missiles, and the bombs don't arm. Post-war analysis notes that despite the pattern of unexploded ordnance becoming apparent across multiple attacks, the fundamental attack profile wasn't altered. The pilots continued flying as they had been briefed. The dilemma remained unresolved. It began on May 12th. HMS Glasgow on patrol ahead of the main task force. A single bomb from an attacking aircraft entered Glasgow's hull on one side and exited on the other, passing completely through the ship before falling into the sea beyond her, unexploded. Glasgow was damaged but afloat. Her crew knew, surveying the entry and exit holes in their ship, that the only reason the vessel still existed was that the weapon hadn't armed. A patched hole in a hull is survivable. The detonation of a 1,000-pound bomb inside a warship's machinery spaces isn't. The full scale of what San Carlos water was going to mean for the fleet became apparent on May 21st, the first day of the amphibious landings. HMS Antrim absorbed a 1,000-pound bomb that lodged deep in the ship's structure without detonating. The weapon sat somewhere below decks, fully intact, while Antrim continued to operate in the anchorage. Her crew worked around an object that subsequent days would confirm was perfectly capable of killing everyone aboard. Antrim survived the day. HMS Broadsword's encounter carried an almost surreal quality. A bomb hit the sea alongside her, ricocheted upward at an angle, punched through the ship's flight deck from below, and emerged on the other side, falling back into the water beyond the hull, unexploded. Broadsword also absorbed cannon fire from the same air attacks and survived that too. HMS Argonaut's situation was different in a way that carried its own particular horror. Bombs struck Argonaut below the waterline, and the flooding they caused trapped 2 crewmen in the ship's forward magazine. Those men died there, not from a bomb blast, but from the flooding that came through the hull where the impacts had opened it to the sea. The bombs themselves didn't explode. The flooding killed. Argonaut's weapon systems, her propulsion, her crew as a whole survived the day, with 2 men in a compartment the ship couldn't reach. HMS Ardent didn't survive. 9 bombs struck her on 21st May across engagements in San Carlos water and Falkland Sound, hitting her through the afternoon as successive waves of Argentine aircraft found her. The combination of detonating ordnance and structural damage overwhelmed the crew's capacity to respond. 22 of Ardent's company were killed. She sank the following day. Ardent's loss belongs to a different category from the UXB ships. Her attackers scored hits that functioned as designed, but she shows what the afternoon of 21st May would have looked like for the entire fleet if the bombs hitting the other ships had also armed. On May 25th, the same day Atlantic Conveyor was struck, HMS Coventry was sunk north of Pebble Island by 3 bombs dropped by Argentine aircraft in a coordinated attack. 20 of her crew were killed. Coventry, like Ardent, was destroyed by bombs that detonated. She is a reminder that the Argentine Air Force was entirely capable of killing ships when the mechanics worked. The UXB record isn't evidence that Argentine bombing was ineffective. It's evidence of exactly how effective it would have been. On the 22nd of May, Staff Sergeant James Prescott of the Royal Engineers came aboard HMS Argonaut. His task was explosive ordnance disposal, to locate the unexploded bomb inside the damaged ship and render it safe. The spaces he worked in were confined, still wet from flooding, in a warship that was operational and could face another air attack before his work was complete. Prescott worked methodically through the task, applied the training he carried, and successfully defused the bomb. He came ashore that evening. He was alive. By the standards of what his work required, a successful defusal and a return to shore was the best possible outcome. The following day, 23rd May, HMS Antelope was attacked in San Carlos water by Argentine aircraft and struck by 2 1,000-pound bombs. Both buried themselves inside the ship. Neither detonated on impact. Antelope's captain brought her to anchor in the northern arm of San Carlos water as darkness came. The ship's crew spent that evening in a vessel they knew contained 2 1,000-pound weapons, intact, embedded somewhere in the hull, waiting. The question wasn't whether the bombs could kill them. Antelope's end would answer that question definitively. The question was what happened when the disposal team worked on them. Prescott came back. He and Warrant Officer John Phillips boarded Antelope on the evening of 23rd May to begin defusal of one of the 2 weapons. The work required them to descend into the damaged interior of the ship, past the impact points where the bombs had entered, through compartments that the weapons had torn through on their way in, down to where one of them had finally come to rest. Bomb disposal in warship spaces is hands-on work in confined areas. There is no remote procedure, no extended standoff distance, no version of the task that puts the operators at a point where an unexpected detonation becomes survivable. Both men would have understood this with complete professional clarity. Prescott had done it successfully on Argonaut 24 hours earlier. He understood the risk. He went in anyway. At 21:23, on the night of 23rd May, the bomb detonated. The explosion tore Antelope open from her waterline to her funnel. The force of it vented outward through both sides of the hull and upward through the decks above. Major fires took hold simultaneously in both engine rooms, fed by ruptured fuel lines and the stored energy of a warship's machinery spaces. Staff Sergeant James Prescott from Auchinleck in Scotland was killed instantly. Warrant Officer John Phillips was thrown by the blast. He lost his left arm. He survived. By dawn on 24th May, the fires burning through HMS Antelope were beyond any attempt at control. The ship's structure was compromised at multiple points. Her crew abandoned her, and through the following hours she burned in full view of the ships at anchor around her and the troops on the beaches nearby. A first aid orderly who had been aboard when the bomb exploded later described the suddenness of it, the transition from the deliberate, careful work of a defusal attempt to catastrophic violence in a single instant. The photographs taken that night and the following morning, Antelope's silhouette against the black Falkland sky, a column of fire rising from her midsection where the explosion had opened her, the glow reflected in the flat water of the anchorage, appeared on the front pages of British newspapers. Those images were the visual evidence of what a 1,000-pound weapon produced when it detonated inside a warship. The same type of weapon that had passed through HMS Glasgow and bounced through HMS Broadsword's flight deck. The same type of weapon sitting inside HMS Antrim. What the photograph showed was the answer to the question every crew member on every UXB ship had been carrying since their own bomb passed through their hull. Staff Sergeant James Prescott was awarded the Conspicuous Gallantry Medal posthumously. He had defused one bomb successfully and given his life attempting the second. The second one destroyed the ship. One analysis of the air campaign's outcomes concluded that unexploded bombs could easily have doubled the losses of British warships had the fuses functioned correctly on impact. The arithmetic requires no elaboration. Antrim, Broadsword, Argonaut, Glasgow, each struck by weapons of the same type that detonated when it eventually did go off. Antelope's end, lit by fire against a Falkland night, is the proof of what those ships survived. The Argentine pilots who flew those attacks deserve an accounting that the mechanical failure of their bombs can too easily obscure. First Lieutenant Mariano Velasco was among those who flew bombing runs against the British fleet. He and his fellow pilots attacking San Carlos water had correctly identified the tactical solution to the problem they had been given. The Sea-Dart engagement floor existed at a specific altitude, and the Argentine Air Force had briefed its crews to exploit it. That assessment was sound. The penetration rates their attacks achieved, aircraft actually reaching weapons release range after flying through concentrated defensive fire, demonstrated its validity. Their bombing accuracy against ships in the confined channel was real. The bombs struck where the pilots aimed them. What was entirely outside their control was the physics of the fuse. The altitude that kept them alive inside the defensive envelope was the same altitude that prevented their bombs from arming. Fly higher and Sea-Dart kills more of them. Fly low, survive, but the bombs don't arm. The dilemma wasn't resolvable by any individual pilot and wasn't apparent to any crew on any individual attack run. An Argentine pilot pulling off target after his bomb release didn't know whether his weapon had armed or not. He had seen the impact. He couldn't see the propeller on the fuse nose and whether it had turned. That information existed only in the damage reports being filed by the ships he had just left behind him. Argentine aircrew losses during the San Carlos phase were severe, and the men who flew those attacks were doing something that required both considerable skill and a specific kind of courage. Threading fast aircraft through walls of defensive fire at altitudes that allowed almost no margin for error. The tactic that nearly destroyed the British fleet was the correct solution to a real defensive problem. The equipment failure that prevented it from succeeding wasn't visible to the people operating that equipment. There was no adjustment available to them in the air, on the mission, in the moment. It was only ever solvable at the command level, in the planning before the sortie. And solving it would have required accepting the casualties that the low-level approach was designed to avoid. Some of the bombs that embedded themselves in British ships were British manufactured. They had been sold to Argentina in the years before the conflict. Ordnance built in the United Kingdom, capable of ending the campaign in Argentine victory, defeated not by any deficiency in the weapon itself, but by the conditions under which it had to be delivered. The bomb was a capable weapon. The altitude didn't give it time to demonstrate that. The final 4 entries in the UXB record came on June 8th, when HMS Plymouth was attacked in Falkland Sound by Argentine Air Force Grupo 6 Dagger aircraft. 4 bombs struck Plymouth. All 4 failed to detonate. Plymouth survived. That was bomb number 10 through 13 in the sequence that began with HMS Glasgow on 12th of May. And it came on the same day that Argentine Daggers also attacked RFA Sir Galahad at Bluff Cove in one of the conflict's single worst human disasters. The Falklands air campaign exacted its costs unevenly, and the UXB record ran alongside a parallel accounting of ships and men that the fuses didn't spare. By 30th of May 1982, Argentina had expended all 5 of its air-launched AM-39 Exocets. The 6th and final Exocet of the conflict, a shore-launched weapon, not air-launched, struck HMS Glamorgan on 12th of June, causing damage but not sinking her. The super-étendard supply was spent. The carriers had not been hit. On June 14, 1982, the Argentine garrison in Stanley surrendered. 74 British service personnel had been killed in the naval and air campaign. The task force that sailed 8,000 miles from the UK, without adequate airborne early warning, without reserve assets, without a fallback if the carriers were lost, had held together and won. The victory was real. The documents that sit in the UK National Archives at Kew, including the Board of Inquiry files on HMS Sheffield under reference DEFE 25/555, record in procedural and factual detail the specific vulnerabilities that Argentine air power came within measurable distances of exploiting completely. The AEW gap that left Sheffield blind to an incoming Exocet, her Type 965 radar couldn't reliably detect at sea-skimming altitude. The warning that HMS Invincible failed to relay. The fuse propellers that didn't turn enough times in the air between the aircraft and the hull. The 3 Chinooks that went down with Atlantic Conveyor and the one that didn't. The 2 Exocets that were fired at something and found a container ship. Woodward's memoir puts a human voice to what those files record in official language. He was the man who held the battle group together, knowing what the loss of either carrier would mean, who managed the arithmetic of 4 Exocets and 2 irreplaceable ships for weeks on end, who received the damage reports from San Carlos water and understood what the UXB count represented in terms of what had almost happened. He didn't write about the campaign as a demonstration of British military mastery. He wrote about a man doing the best he could with what he had, in conditions that offered very little margin for anything going wrong. Lord Craig's assessment is the most economical version of what those files and that memoir together show. 6 better fuses. Not a different strategy, not a different missile inventory, not a different political decision. 6 fuses. 6 small propellers on the noses of 6 1,000-pound bombs that needed to complete more rotations before hitting British steel than the altitude of the attack allowed them to complete. 6 of those, functioning correctly, and the ships that survived San Carlos water don't survive it. The escort screen collapses, the beachhead fails, the war ends differently. History recorded what happened. The men who were there knew how close the alternative came to being what happened instead. If you want more history that the official record rounds up to certainty, subscribe. There are more of these stories than you might expect.